Well, good morning, everyone. This is Dorian here, and I promise that my next Facebook Live will be to discuss good news in the world as soon as we get some. But today, another startling set of bad news on unemployment. 6.6 million unemployment insurance claims were filed last week. The total that brings it to over 16 million claims, surely an undercount, that were filed in the last 3 weeks. And it sort of paints a picture of an economic system in free fall. Here with me today to talk about what these latest numbers mean is my old Chicago friend, Mike Konczal, who is the director of progressive thought at the Roosevelt Institute. And he works on financial reform, unemployment, inequality, and a progressive vision of the economy. His blog, Roarty Bomb, was named one of the top 25 best financial blogs by Time Magazine. So good morning, Mike, and say hi to our Facebook friends.
Hey, thanks for having me on, everyone, and good morning to you as well, my Southside friend.
Hey, speaking of South, we're going to talk about Chicago in a bit, but let's just start with the basics, Mike. Has the economy ever faced something like this in terms of the pure speed and scale of people being thrown out of work? Help us make meaning of the numbers today as well as the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, essentially we haven't. Certainly not in the last 100 years. You have to go back to the Great Depression. Even then, this feels like a very different and specifically unique event. If you think about the Great Recession, which is a very traumatic recession, it took maybe about 6 to 8 months for unemployment to get up to the level of about 10%. We are almost certainly well above that in the matter of course, about 2 to 3 weeks. The data is coming in slower than the damage is being done. So we have to be very conscious that any number you're hearing, the reality on the ground is far worse. But this kind of 30% contraction in 1 quarter, which is kind of what we're talking about, is just simply does not happen. And as such, our tools, even when our tools work well, are not really up for the task. So we need to be innovating ways to handle this recession in real time, which is very difficult.
So, Mike, I'm struck by something you said because one of my best friends, Chris, also from Chicago and is a dancer in New York, he has lost work, right? He's a dance instructor and a performer. And I've heard him on calls with the New York State Unemployment Office, not able to get through. He's been on hold for 2 hours at a time. So talk to me a little bit about how these astronomical numbers, over 16 million, how it might actually be an undercount in terms of the claims being processed or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've heard things where places are getting calls in the course of a week or even a day that they normally handle in a month. And remember that a lot of these systems have atrophy. They're not kept up to date. They were put into place decades ago. And in many places, they're kind of not kept up to date on purpose because more conservative governors or state legislators want people to not claim unemployment insurance, that they want to say massage or juke those numbers to make their unemployment numbers look better, or separately, they just don't want to pay out unemployment insurance, even though it's a benefit workers pay for in their paychecks. So both actual practical speed, even when the system's working well, of just the being able to take these numbers of calls and these numbers of claims is difficult, even beyond the fact that in many places the system is hostile to people being able to exercise their rights here.
So one of the things, Mike, that struck me about these numbers in this last month that we've been living through is how much of this pain has been focused on low-wage workers, particularly in Black and brown communities. So talk to us about just how is this impacting particular communities harder and particular sectors of the economy harder? How do you read these numbers?
Sure. So it's really hard to get official numbers that are broken down by sector as well as we would like in terms of how quick the economy is falling apart. But we know very obviously that it's hitting service sector work quite hard. And there's a 2-part problem here. One is that obviously social distancing makes a lot of services very difficult to execute by definition. Second, and this is the real worry for a lot of people, is that, where maybe you would buy a car or a couch or a house right now, and you're not going to because of social distancing in the quarantine, but you'll do it in the fall when things come back, or at least you could. If you were going to go out for dinner, if you were going to get a house cleaned, if you're going to hire daycare, if you're going to do hiring a lot of services, you're not going to double that up in the fall. So that's a lot of income that's lost to people that's not replaced later on. It's not just moved forward. And as a result, that lower income means that people are going to have harder times paying rent, and it has a real ripple effect across the economy, which lowers incomes for everyone. This is the basic mechanism of a recession. It's really hard to stopgap unless you're consciously trying to do it.
So just to note one more thing on this, because I'm being from Chicago, as are you. We're both Southsiders. So I just want to make a point for a minute about the health realities, which are also quite disparate. So even though the Center for Disease Control has not released fatality rates by race, state and local governments have been continuing to publish really alarming findings that indicate, in particular, Black Americans make up more than 80% of coronavirus-related deaths in some cities. In Chicago, we just heard a story yesterday about Cook County Jail as being a particular place where the outbreak is off the charts. So it just speaks to some of the pre-existing racial inequalities baked into the system that are now having this outsized effect, right? When you combine the health crisis and the economic crisis. Let's talk about the disproportionate impacts in terms of communities of color, but related to the larger structural problems in the rules of our society and economy. And you've thought a lot about this. So even in an emergency, shouldn't we be talking about how to make down payments on longer term shifts like guaranteed jobs and income supports? And talk to us also about what are the unemployment insurance tools available to ordinary people? So other countries are continuing to support companies to keep workers on the payroll. From where you sit, what are the range of solutions to this crisis that we're facing?
Yeah, so as with most crises, that they tend to hit people of color and poor communities much harder. Like in Chicago, in the I believe the 1990s had the heat wave.
Yes.
That really hit Black and brown communities very hard. And this is a concentrated version of all of those kinds of health crises that play out through social and economic structures. Communities, of course, have less resources. They have less access to healthcare in general. They're often working essential jobs, which here weirdly means jobs that are underpaid, and or maybe not so weirdly, jobs that are underpaid and much more precarious for jobs that are essential in keeping the society together, delivering things, working the food chain, and so on. So both in terms of under-resourced and when there are jobs, the jobs specifically are very precarious and not well protected with basic things like paid and sick leave, makes it really vulnerable for those communities and for everyone, because it is a social disease fundamentally. So yeah, the numbers are very shocking, I think, even for people who anticipate that this would be bad for communities of color. Mm-hmm. The numbers seem to, the preliminary numbers seem to be correctly shocking people because they are quite awful. You know, we know fundamentally what we need to do. We need to backstop payroll. So we need to make sure businesses can maintain their businesses and their job relations so that they can come back to life in a few months when we're past the peak of this. Mm-hmm. For people who are laid off, we need to backstop their jobs. So that's unemployment insurance. For people who do not have access to paid work, people who are unemployed, disabled, caregiving, students, we need to send them checks. So that's basic income. And then states need to be backstopped as well, because states are going to they eat they eat a lot of costs here and they lose a lot of revenue in a recession. And this is a very serious one. So we know the tools, and we're doing a little bit of each of them, but we're not doing them enough.
I want to double click on what you just said about states and state governments and cities. This is really, I'm obsessed with this because it's a huge problem, and it's coming at us in slow motion, right? So we're starting to hear news of cities and states cutting budgets, laying off workers. It's really concerning because people who hold public sector jobs tend to perform really important public services we need even more so in a pandemic, whether it's trash collecting, teaching, childcare. So when the crisis really hits cities and states, they're going to see a decline in revenue, right, in terms of sales tax and income tax. They're going to have to cut budgets for things like Medicaid, right? And people need access to medical care and free medical care in this moment. So talk to us about what can Congress do to help cities and states to make sure they have the resources to provide essential services and support for people that are experiencing this health and economic crisis?
Yeah, and there's two parts to it. One is that as you mentioned, the cuts are immediate, which is quite bad for prolonging the recession and cutting services people need. But second, as we saw in the Great Recession, and as we more generally have seen over the last 40 years, is as those cuts happen in a recession, they're not made up in when times are better. So colleges, which I follow pretty closely, since 1980, whenever there's a recession, funding for colleges are cut, which increases student loans and causes individuals to have to pick up the gap. But during the boom times when unemployment's low, states don't ever make that up. And they don't make it up with a lot of other things too in essential public services. So if you think the public sector needs to play a stronger role in providing baseline of security for people, which I do, it's double bad than just the immediate crisis. So there's a lot of things Congress can solve the problem very easily by just backstopping states. The problem is one of money, and it's very easy for Congress to get money to people. It's harder for them to get money to individuals on short-term notice, but every state treasurer knows how to get to the IRS and vice versa. So this is really a question of political will. Congress doesn't want to send money to the states because they don't necessarily get credit for it because it's the states who do it. There's a hostile, there's a blue-red state hostility that we've seen play out with access to medical services, ventilators, and supplies from the Trump administration to various states, which has a whole political dynamic to it. But it's not, there are questions right now that are very difficult about how to technocratically solve tinkering problems, like essentially plumbing problems in our economy. This is not one of them. This is pure political will.
This is pure political will, and so stay tuned, folks, because we're going to ask you to stay engaged, right? Because you can help shape political will in terms of how we respond to this crisis. Okay, Mike, last question. Help us understand what to expect once the pandemic has ended. What factors should we take into account to understand whether we're going to have a fast recovery, a slow recovery? Are there certain sectors of the economy that will rise faster or recover faster than others? What should we expect on the other side of this?
I mean, that's the biggest question, and everyone's trying to figure it out, and it depends so much on what's done. One thing that won't be an issue is government debt. The way, people talk about $2 trillion, that seems really excessive and huge on a number scale, but in terms of the size of our economy and the size of the problem we're facing, it's very small. And if the government, say, did another $2 trillion, we would not feel that as a burden for coming out of the recession. If it causes issues 20 years down the line, we can deal with it then. But whether or not we come into a fast recovery or a slow recovery means the world of difference for how the government can manage its deficit and debt. That's the first thing, and it's just worth reiterating. Second is, you have to watch what businesses do not come back online when the recession's over. If a lot of businesses pop right back, or they rehire people that they laid off, if we actually did a nationwide furlough for a few weeks, and that was the extent of it, then we're in a lot better shape. If there is essentially a lot of businesses that don't reopen, a lot of people decide that they can't keep it going, if there's a lot of backlog of debt that, if you're a small business owner and you have this rent check that you didn't pay for 3 months, now it just hangs over you and prevents you from hiring, that's a big problem if there's this kind of debt overhang that suppresses economic activity. But that startup is really what we want to watch. And if there are things we can do, even though they might seem extreme in normal times, like a rent freeze, or rent cancellation for businesses and individuals, they are absolutely worth it if it means that the economy can get back up, because we can always figure that out later. We can't just replicate or replace millions of businesses and millions of jobs overnight.
So actually, I said that was my last question, but really last question. What should people be looking to do and say, especially to their members of Congress in this period?
That would be my question for you, because that's more your world than my world. I want to emphasize that there is no playbook here. There are things where there are very well negotiated lines about where, like expanding healthcare or voting rights, where there's very clear partisan lines. There's very clear lines within the parties about who can do what, how. There is no playbook here. Members of Congress are honestly scared about what's happening. They don't know how to do it well. This is not something people plan for. Economists don't really think about how to handle these kinds of scenarios. They think about banking crises, or a normal recession, or a business going out of business, or something like that. a quarter-long Great Depression event, which is what we're talking about, is not part of the playbook. So as such, I think your voice might be more powerful than you would think, because members of Congress are very open to being pushed, I believe. So organized action can make more of a difference than it would in normal times.
So that's a great place to end, because one of the things I want to say to everybody who's watching this is to tell your story. Tell your story, how you're affected, how your family has been affected by this crisis, how your neighbors, friends. Storytelling is really important, and especially your story. It's super important to tell your story to your elected officials, and keep hammering at them. Keep letting them know. Call, email. They're answering phones these days. Call and email them. Tweet at them. Tell them the story of how people in your life and your loved ones, if not you, are suffering, and why you need help, and why it's the role of the government to step in and do its job, because we elected these folks to serve us. Follow Rorty Bomb on Twitter. This is Mike Konczal, who's been having this conversation with me this morning. Thank you, Mike. He's the director of progressive thought at the Roosevelt Institute, and my old South Side of Chicago friend. And watch this space next week. We'll be back with another update on how to make meaning of what's happening in terms of our public health crisis and our economic crisis. With that, I want to say thank you to Mike, and thanks to all of you for watching this morning.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Be well.